Hello, everyone. So this is actually a bigger turnout than I expected. I think I didn't think anybody would be interested in hearing anything from an interpreter at game and music convention, but thank you for coming. My name is Akira Negi. I'm not a professional interpreter, but I do some Japanese English interpreting at a couple of conventions. And if you're from this local area in particular, you may have possibly seen me on stage at one of them. And I also work with some conventions to coordinate some international guests, particularly from Japan. So just to give you just a tiny bit of background, my actual real life job is actually a travel agent. And I actually arrange travel for a number of events, including MAGFest actually. On Saturdays, I actually teach at the local Japanese language school where I get to teach Japanese high school students. So, and with the travel job, some of my clients are Japanese, so I get to use Japanese and English on a regular basis in my life. So anyway, so that's how I do interpreting. Not in a truly official capacity, I would say, but certainly at the convention level. And just so that we're on the same page here, my deal with MAGFest was that because a lot of stuff that I do are somewhat confidential, I wasn't going to get a presentation ready because that was too much work on figuring out what am I actually allowed to say. But you all are welcome to ask me questions, and I'm happy to answer questions in whatever the capacity that I can. So anyway, so that's where I am, and that's why I'm here. Let's see. So do you want to come up as well, or? Okay. I also have a friend of mine who's coming with me who works for a couple of events in an interpreter capacity, as well as work with some other conventions as well. So if need be, we'll bring her up as well. So anyway, so I assume you're here because you have some questions, and we'll start with one. I think your hand went up first. So this piece of paper tells me that I have to repeat your question. So the question was, my first language is apparently Japanese, and how did I learn English? So I'll give you a little bit of background on that as well. I was born and raised in Japan. When I was 12, my father was transferred within the company to our US office, and we barely had 6 months notice. And you're not going to pick up a language in 6 months, especially not when you're starting from zero and you're as different as Japanese and English. I don't know if anybody here's tried to learn Japanese. Okay, that's a larger number than I expected. So you know how difficult it is as an English speaker to learn Japanese. So if you take that difficulty, that's about the difficulty that the Japanese speakers are experiencing on the other side. Some of you think that English is much easier because there's only 24 characters, 26, excuse me. And, but it just means that the language is that much more different. Difference is what makes it that much more difficult. Now, has anybody tried to learn French or Spanish in here? Okay. So does anybody think Japanese was easier than French or Spanish? Okay. That's very unusual. I want to talk to you later, maybe. So when the language is similar, it's way easier. So anyway, I had 6 months to prepare, and basically that got me through learning maybe 100 words of English, if that. And this is me being a 12-year-old. And if you think back to when you're 12-year-old, spending a lot of time learning a language when you're being forced to learn one isn't really going to work all that well. So I moved to the US, and the first year, I literally do not remember having a meaningful conversation with an English speaker. And the second year onward was a little bit better, but the ESL program, English as a Second Language program at school, it took me 3 years to get out of that, and honestly, I was one of the quick ones to exit the program. So that's how I started. Now, the part where I did get lucky is that by 12, your language is pretty solid. So as long as you do, I wouldn't call it minimal, but like a hair above minimal to keep up your original language, the chance of forgetting is relatively little. So I did that. So my Japanese is fine, as long as you don't ask me to write something that my handwriting is atrocious to, like, well, we don't talk about that, but anyway. And obviously I do okay on the English side as well. And so that's how I gained the language skill. And you all get to decide whether my English is native level or near native level. But so there is that. Now, does that answer your questions?
Absolutely. I was just, I guess, trying to just highlight the realistic process of the amount of time it can take to learn a language.
Yeah, thank you. So his comment for the people who need the microphone is that how long does it take to pick up a new language to be a functional interpreter? And it's going to vary if you start as an adult. It is probably going to take longer than 3 years. And also it matters as to what level of proficiency you're trying to reach. One of the questions I hate the most is, how many languages do you speak? English and Japanese, that's fine. I mean, I obviously speak them, I got no problems. Well, I spent 3 years learning Spanish in high school too. Do I count that or not? I don't know. I mean, like there's probably like 30, 40 people in the audience. Like if you did 3 years of like Spanish or French, would you claim that and claim that that's one of your languages? All right, so the majority says no. So in that sense, I probably speak two. So anyway, in order to get to the level that you're going to be near native in a language that's as different as Japanese and English, you're probably looking at the minimum, several years of really hard work. If you're doing casual, then you're probably looking at really persisting at learning a little bit a day for probably close to 10 years before you reach that level. Again, it depends on how much effort you put in, as well as what level you want to reach. And there's also a little bit of personal difference in where you're good at language or not, but honestly, to me, that matters well, like much less than how much effort you put into it and what level you want to reach. Yeah. So, all right, we'll go to the next question. The gentleman in the front.
Yes, thank you. So I took a JLPT N3 last year, on which I'm still waiting for the results, and one thing I really struggle with is listening comprehension, especially if I'm listening to like a podcast or an interview. Oftentimes I'll catch like maybe the beginning of a sentence, the end of the sentence, and maybe some keywords, but sometimes it's just such a fast blur, and sometimes with listening exercises I'll import it into Audacity, slow it down by more than 50%, play it multiple times over, and I'm still like, what is being said? So I guess my question is, what is the best way for me to improve my listening comprehension skills?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the question being, what is the best way to improve listening comprehension? The first and foremost, you have to practice. In order to improve your listening comprehension, you have to listen a lot. whether it be podcast or anime with Japanese dialogues or things on YouTube, what have you. You have to listen. That's first and foremost. And the next level is then what do you do with it? If your goal is that you're going to get better at it, then you have to actively listen. You have to figure out what it is that they're trying to say, and you have to pay attention. And if you feel that you're not getting all of it, then for the purpose of practicing, you have to spend at least some time focusing on it, paying more attention than you do in listening to or watching something else. Something that I don't know if this matters this day and age, but when I talked to some other people 30 years ago, one key difference that I noticed in people who reached a higher level of comprehension that all of them were doing were watching TV and writing down every word that they came across that they didn't understand. And they actually looked it up later. And then a lot of them, I think, try to watch the same thing again later. Now, I think the modern day equivalent is somewhat different, but I'm sure it's there. If you do something like that, I'm sure your skills would improve. And then just exposing yourself a lot in general. You're not going to be able to watch TV or listen to podcasts like that all day, every day. You're just going to lose yourself if you do that. So if you do that for a little bit of the time, and then maybe do more casual listening in some other ways and do a combination, I think you would probably see an improvement. And also, I think listening and speaking go hand in hand. So if you can get a chance to speak, that will probably help as well. Let's see, I think you had your hand up next.
Yes. Hello. So I had a question about, because you being a native speaker of Japanese, have you noticed people who their first language is either like Spanish, English, or like French, and then when they learn Japanese, do you notice any difference between native speakers who become interpreters and people whose second language become interpreters for Japanese?
Yes, so differences in interpreters depending on what their native language is. The biggest thing that comes across is whatever the native language is of that speaker, when you're translating into that language, it sounds more natural. And it's usually the easier of the two to do for whoever that person is. It's actually a little bit easier for me to go from English to Japanese than Japanese to English. I've done it enough that I don't really notice the difference, but I think there's a difference in between when you're learning a language as an adult and then becoming an interpreter, which, by the way, if you go that route, that usually requires some level of training before you can be a true interpreter, whereas I was lucky enough to have 2 languages before I ever considered doing interpreting as any kind of a job volunteer or otherwise. So that's a different process at that point. And the results are different in that way too. But it's almost always easier to go into your native language. That goes the same with the writing as well, by the way. The habits of the native language usually carry into whatever the language you're translating into. Probably the best example I can give you is when Koreans try to speak Japanese and then to do interpreting, and then you can vouch for it, I think. Korean language doesn't differentiate between some sounds, like the B sound and a P sound, and I think the T sound and the D sound as well. So in Japanese, that's a huge difference. And also, there are cases where those are clearly related in Japanese, but you have to differentiate them in a certain situation. And I think Korean does that too. Like, I think the B sound and the P sound exists in a language, but it's more of an unconscious differentiation rather than like a conscious differentiation there. So the way in which those sounds are used are sometimes wrong when you compare it strictly within the language you're translating into. And that sort of habit carry into it, whatever the native language is. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Except I learned the Japanese. So I was fluent in Korean. I moved to the United States and went to Japan. So when I was learning, I had an influence of English and the Japanese. So, and also, another thing I did was that I listened to the drama before I learned the grammars and everything, so I thought it sounds better. So I don't have that much of Korean accent issues with the Japanese, but I've seen a lot of Koreans who went straight from Korean to Japanese that have that Korean accent that shows up.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Sue. Yeah, so another good example I can give you is when the Japanese person it goes into English, singular and plural are often wrong because Japanese has very vague differentiation between the two. Articles are almost always wrong because Japanese doesn't have articles. And that's actually one of the harder things for Japanese speakers to pick up. So you will notice things like that. And of course, the ideal is that you don't make such noticeable mistakes, I'll call it. But that's at a pretty high level at that point. Let's see. I'm not even sure who was next. I'm just going to go in that general area, I think. I think the gentleman in purple had the hand up first.
What is, when you're doing interpretation, what is going through your head? Like how much conscious, like really purposeful thought do you have on translating the grammar or getting the feeling across or sounding natural? I'm just curious what that mind space is like.
Sure. So the question being, what goes through my mind while I'm actually actively interpreting? So if it's anything that's more than a couple lines and it's complex, I have to take notes to do a good job. Sometimes I don't have the luxury of that, and that's a truly hard job when that happens. But as I'm writing down, I'm usually noticing where the key words are and trying to remember how the sentence is structured and what is actually being said. So the difference between interpreting and translating is that translating goes into writing and that remains semi-permanently. So if you make an even tiny bit of a mistake, people will remember it permanently. Whereas the job of the interpreter, it's great if you can do it perfectly, but your job is more that in the split second you go into the other language so that the audience understands what's going on. And if you make a tiny mistake, nobody will remember it 2 seconds later. So that's a different mindset. Now, so usually I'm saying translating, but I'm interpreting in my mind as to whatever it is that I would say the same thing in the other language, and I will write down in the ways that I can. I don't know about you, but I can't write that fast, so I just write down the keywords. And then once I come to a good stopping point, then I go back and make sure I get the main ideas correctly. And as long as all of the key ideas are conveyed correctly, whether it's said in the perfect way or you're at 80% level in terms of words, but you're still conveying the right idea. Nobody really cares at that point. But you're just trying to concentrate on the main ideas and about as accurate as it is reasonably possible. And if somebody rambles around and goes around in a circle 3 times before you get into the idea, that circle, they're lucky if you get one of those circles. And that's not really necessary for the purpose of interpreting. Whereas if you're translating, you probably will actually want to translate that. So those are some of the things that I do. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
You looped around to all of my follow-ups.
Okay. Great, thank you. And I was actually pointing to the other gentleman in purple, so let's get your question.
I have to break it up a little bit. I have a travel agent type question for you.
Okay.
It seems like Japanese, East Coast U.S. to Japan airfares are higher from post-pandemic than before pandemic. What is driving that increase?
Okay. So the question is, why is the airfare expensive? So I will answer it extremely briefly because for those of you who didn't look it up, I actually do have a travel panel at 6 p.m. in the same room. But I'll give you a very brief answer. The supply is low and the demand is high. China in particular is opening up, and whereas the pre-pandemic, I think the number of flights was 161 direct flights between U.S. and U.S. and China, and post-pandemic, like for a while, it was down to like 14. And countries like places like Hong Kong and Singapore had a lot of direct flights, and a lot of those were lost to the pandemic. Well, what do you do when you have to get to those destinations? If you can't take a direct, you take a connecting flight. Japan reduced flights significantly less than the other countries, and they were much earlier in coming back as well. So a lot of people were connecting in Japan to get to points in Asia, more so than you could ever imagine. That traffic is still there, and so with the fewer flights in general going to Asia, the flights are a lot more full, and therefore it can sustain a higher fare. And also Japan opened up much earlier than some of the other places in Asia, so the tourism is way up in Japan as well. And not to mention the fuel cost being high. So there's really, the natural answer is that there is no force to make the fare go down. All right. Next question. I think the gentleman in white behind the purple gentleman.
Can I try asking in Japanese?
Yes.
もう母語が英語だけど、日本語を勉強してる、日本語で喋る人の癖、なんですか、アクセントとか、よく間違ってることとか、そういう、yeah.
Okay. All right. Now you get to repeat that in English for the audience.
What are some mistakes or habits that Japanese, people with native in English but are learning Japanese tend to have when they're translating or speaking?
Let's see. That actually is a tough question. The habits of English speakers when they speak Japanese. So a lot of speakers, especially in the initial stage, have the rhythm wrong. And Japanese is set up so that, as a basic rule, each syllable has the same length. You don't really get that until you start really digging into Japanese. So my friend who is a Japanese teacher says that the people who don't learn the Japanese writing never catch that. So that's one of the earlier ones. There are some sounds that are particularly difficult for English speakers. The RY sound is pretty difficult for most foreigners, to be honest, but definitely English speakers. The English speakers have a very difficult time differentiating between the short vowels and the long vowels, as well as short consonants and long consonants. So those are probably areas that I noticed the most. Now, that's not necessarily just limited to English speakers, but those are probably pretty typical. I think one of the harder ones to learn for English speakers are the English words that have become Japanese, but under the Japanese pronunciation. We all make fun of that fast food chain with golden arches, because neither language can interpret what the other language is saying. Those are some of the ones that I can think of. Right. The gentleman in glasses.
So this is kind of a question specific to me, so if you can't answer it, that's fine. But so I'm learning Japanese to read books, right? Because I'm frustrated that it's taking forever for them to be translated to English. But I am visually impaired, so I rely on text-to-speech to read. In English, that's fine, right? If I catch a mistake, since I'm fluent in it, I get it. But in Japanese, since there's like 1,000 different readings for a single kanji, they seem to get it wrong. Do you happen to know of like any text-to-speech, reliable text-to-speech options, or do you just have to rely on official recordings in terms of reading for enjoyment?
Specific to your question about do I know any text-to-speech software in Japanese that works, and the answer is I'm afraid not. That is not an area that I'm familiar with at all, so I don't have an answer. What I can tell you is why that's an issue. Japanese have fewer phonemes than most languages. I forget the exact count, but Japanese officially have 5 vowels. Each of them have a long and a short form. And consonants, oh gosh, I can do this. Something in the order of 15 to 20 or so. And if you're good at math, that's in the hundreds. If you do the same thing in English, you're well into the thousands. When you have different components of a sound and you have more of it, you can create more combinations to create more words. Japanese have way fewer, so when you have similar number of words total, you're going to have a lot more words that's going to sound exactly the same. And what Japanese have done for centuries is to differentiate them by using kanji and say that if it's used with this kanji, it means this, whereas if it's this other kanji, it means that. So there's a lot more visual reliance, and some of that carries into the spoken language too. And I can tell you that's where the difficulty is. Now, I'm afraid I don't know the answer as to what companies have overcome that. So if somebody in the audience know, please let them know. I'm afraid I don't have the answer. Okay. Oh.
I was just going to ask, would you say that in that case, it's better to practice relying on context, in the case where you might hear something similar, say, well, maybe they meant this, within this particular context. I was just going to
Yeah, one of the nasty habits of Japanese is that, yes, absolutely it is content driven. Like even if you have 5 words that sound exactly the same, chances are pretty good that in the same context, only one of those 5 will make sense. And to Japanese, that's natural. Well, as somebody who's learning a language is new, that's not going to be clear. And the other horrible habits of Japanese is that Japanese culture relies very heavily on trying to understand each other when something is not said. So the context may only be there in the subtext and not in the forefront, which makes it horribly difficult for people who are trying to learn a language. Ultimately, every language has its own quirks. If you ask any foreigners that are trying to learn English, they'll tell you all the 100 reasons why they hate English. And the same, Japanese will have their own quirks too. In order to get good at Japanese, you can't just do spoken or you can't just do listening. You will have to do speaking, listening, and writing and they do go hand in hand. And the kanji and the spoken language are more closely tied together than you would think. Yeah. The gentleman in green.
Is there an example in which you have to start to interpret the emotional context of something as opposed to all of the things that they're saying? Like they go on a really emotional rant and they go on a tirade and you're like, I can't get all of this. They're just very upset, you know? Has that ever happened?
Emotional tirade to be interpreted. Fortunately for me, I've not been put in that position, and that's because if I'm interpreting, chances are pretty good that I'm doing it in some form of an official capacity, and people tend to remain more calm in that sort of situation than other situations. I won't name the convention, but there was one where somebody was trying to do a premiere of an anime in combination with some related panels. And event tried to cut that event short to the point that halfway through the premiere, they were going to stop it and then move on to the next entirely different panel. And obviously, the company that brought the premiere over was extremely upset. And obviously, event side realized that this is not exactly something they should be doing, but they were asking anyway, so they had their reasons too. And I'm very glad that the parties in that particular discussion remained calm. That was one of the worst interpreting experience ever in my life, because I could tell that neither side was particularly happy. And about the only thing I could do was to concentrate on the content of what is being said and just interpret that and be invisible. That's about the closest I've come. Would I ever interpret an emotional tirade? It would depend on whether that was pertinent to the discussion. If it was just explicitive or to include it in there and that was not material to the content, I would probably just cut that out. Yeah. Let's see, I think, well, you had your hands up, so I'll go ahead.
Oh yes, so at the event where the promoters were getting very emotional and upset about the premiere being cut short, did they maintain polite speaking style, or did they get into some taniguchi?
So in that panel where the premiere was going to be cut, the language was still businesslike. The tone was not exactly calm I could tell that they were very unhappy. I don't know for certain that the English side would have picked up on it, but it was not a particularly calm tone, and I think, well, they tried their best to remain calm under the circumstances. So at that point, it's sort of up to me to interpret at the light level of forcefulness to convey the level of upsetness that they're at, but also keeping in mind that they're trying to be, they're trying to remain polite as well. And if any of you actually do interpreting, that's sort of the expectation. Not that it's always possible, but yeah. So yeah, that was the case. Yeah. Right. I think the gentleman in coat.
You were saying that for English speakers, the things that you don't say in Japanese are difficult for them to get a grasp on. Would you say for native Japanese speakers that unspoken communication actually makes things faster and easier to communicate?
So when things are not spoken in Japanese, is it faster? Probably not. But understand that this is a culture in Japan that has existed for centuries. And especially in the world of business, especially if you're dealing with countries outside of Japan, people recognize that this is not exactly a good habit. Because Japanese might say something and they might expect that the other party would get it automatically. Well, you're not, if you're expecting that of Americans, for example, you're crazy. And even the Japanese realize that. But it's also very difficult to get out of that mold. I do help with communication between Japan and US by email for my paid job as well as convention business. And sometimes I have to be very careful of what I tell to Japan, as well as when I get the email from Japan, I read it with Japanese mind and say, okay, what is this email actually trying to say? Is that an easy process? No, it's not. And there's plenty of Japanese who would be in a similar situation and go, what is this wanting to say? It's like, why is this person not saying it? It's like, I don't understand. And it happens all the time. And that sort of guessing and trying to interpret what the other party is actually trying to say and then acting based on it, that's deeply ingrained in the Japanese culture. I think there is a shift toward being more explicit overall. I think, honestly, the biggest difference I see is that there are people who are willing to be more explicit. It used to be that if you were trying to be explicit, then you were looked at as an outsider and then you weren't really accepted in the society anymore. I don't think that happens anymore. So there's a gradual shift, but it's probably not, definitely in a business where it's not any more efficient, and yeah, it's probably one that Japan needs to shift away from, at least somewhat. Having said all that, Japanese are very good at trying to understand what the other party is thinking or feeling. So in world of hospitality, they do really great. Both of the Japanese airlines, from my paid job, have 5-star rating, and non-Japanese in particular all rave about the service they get on the plane, and there's a good reason for that. They understand that there are things that they need to do, even if the passengers don't speak up and say, "I want this," and that sort of things are common throughout the culture. So I think Japanese are, in general, at least on a casual level anywhere, are almost always very polite to deal with, and they're usually pleasant to deal with on the average. There's positives that are, aside from the efficiency that are visible. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that all Japanese are great people. There are plenty of nasty Japanese people, and I know a few of them personally. It just has different benefits than just a pure efficiency, and it really isn't a question of which is better or worse. It's something that Japanese have done for centuries. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay. Let's go way in the back. Okay, so hard to translate words. So some of the more common words, you just get in the habit of knowing, like, well, if it's this word, it's always this. If it's that common, you as an interpreter, you just input that in your brain. Generally speaking, I work with the mindset that there is nothing that you can't say in a specific language, whether your language is Japanese or English or Swahili or whatever. There's always going to be a way to say it. It might take one word as opposed to 20. So if I can't immediately translate, then I just figure out another way to say it. The ones that got professional training may tell you a different answer, but as somebody who speaks Japanese and English as native or near native level, if I want to say something, I can say it in either language. So I just put myself in a position where I want to say this and think about how I might say it in the other language. And then I just use that. So, whereas a word may turn into 5 words, the point of it is not necessarily a clean translation that you have to come up in a split second. You just have to convey the idea and move on. So that works in that sort of a scenario. I think professional translators will have a very different answer to that. I actually specifically remember this. There was a Japanese drama that was on TV maybe 3 or 4 years ago about somebody who translated Anne of Green Gables into Japanese. And there were several scenes where she would spend like a month trying to translate a word into Japanese. Well, if you try to spend a month translating a word as an interpreter on stage, you're stupid. So, it's a very different world. All right, let's see. I think you had your hand up. Yeah, you. Yeah.
What dialects, either Japanese or English, do you find most challenging, and what about them challenge you?
On the side of Japanese, thankfully, we don't have the expectation that every dialect is to be understood. The standard Japanese is based on the Tokyo dialect. And these days, at least people, I would say through 60s or so, at least the ones who would put themselves in a place where they need to be interpreted will be able to speak that. The one exception is the folks from the Kansai region, that'll be Kyoto, Osaka, Kobe area. Their Western dialect, that is something that they think that the rest of Japan should adapt to. So some of those people truly cannot speak standard Japanese. Thankfully, my mother is from that side of Japan, so I can't speak in that dialect, but understanding is really not a problem. Now, there are cases where I hear dialects from like northern Japan or southern tip of Kyushu, and you might as well be speaking Swahili to me. I don't get it. But that's true of a typical Japanese. So that's outside of expectation. On the side of English, generally, if I'm on stage and then somebody's speaking in a more official capacity, I don't really have issues. But there are some British accents that are a little tough. Irish and Scottish gets a little bit tougher. And I will admit there was one Indian TA that I had in college that, I'm sorry, he was really nice, but I didn't understand a word of what he said. So those are somewhat tough. Yeah, within the continental U.S., I think I'm okay with most of it. I live in North Carolina. At one point, I lived in New York. When I first moved to North Carolina, Southern dialect was very tough. But now that I've been there for a number of years, that's kind of okay now. So I do okay with most of the continental U.S. dialects. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. Let's do the lady up front.
So I've been learning Japanese for a while, and I'm actually looking to do something like you of interpreting to some capacity. But one of the things I've been really struggling with is cable and how to understand that. I didn't know if you sounded like you grew up here in America, so I didn't know if you had any suggestions or ideas of resources of where to kind of fully more understand cable.
Oh yes, keigo, the vein of Japanese. Many languages have the equivalent of a keigo. And the one that is almost always brought up as the one that has one of the most difficult rules is Korean, actually. And basically, it's one of those that there is no way to perfect that unless you put yourself in a situation where you have to use it. This is something that Japanese students will almost always go through in middle and high school. They're pretty strict about that. So once you go through it, you can kind of do it. Now, aside from putting yourself in that sort of a situation, probably the point you want to get to is to speak at a level that nobody thinks that you're rude. Like even if you're not speaking a perfect Keigo, if you're polite, you can usually get a pass. And unless you're in a truly official capacity, if you're polite, they understand you're polite and they move on. And then other things you can sort of take your time learning. I would say in terms of speaking, that's probably good enough. And then you can perfect it in your own time. Writing is a little less forgiving, but you will probably have to be in a capacity where you have to use Japanese professionally before that really matters. And again, you have to be in a place where you have to use it before you can get any good at it. But obviously, if you can't do it, they're not going to just put you in there. So you have to build up to it. Yeah. So that would be my answer to that. Yeah. All right. You've had your hands up, so.
In order to be able to be selected to interpret at a convention, do you need to have JLPT certifications or like specific certifications as part of your application? Or kind of what is the selection process?
So is a JLPT required to be a conventional interpreter? Well, I don't have a JLPT, so. So I can speak to, so ultimately that's up to the convention to decide. And different levels of proficiencies are required for different types of jobs. And it depends on what it is that the event is looking for. Chances are, if you're going on stage and you don't have a JLPT1 or some equivalent skill, you're going to be suffering. So that would be my answer to that part of it. If there are other tasks, it may or may not require JLPT, but it will depend on whatever that task is, and it's up to the event to decide whether that is necessary or not. Now, I will say that I do work for Otakon as an interpreter. In fact, I'm the interpreter manager there. Our rule at Otakon is that the Japanese interpreter must have JLPT1 or some equivalent. And there are certain expectations that come with it. Basically, we think about what is needed to perform the tasks and what are the things that we really need for those interpreters to be able to do. And it's our determination that in order to be able to do all that, if you didn't have JLPT1 or equivalent, it's really asking for trouble. And it depends on what it is that you're asked to do, but for example, if your task is going to be with a VIP guest and something goes wrong and something is not handled because of the language skill, the damage that you may have caused is pretty huge. So if that's the case, then the language skill is absolutely going to be part of the requirement. But in a different capacity, that may not be a part of the requirement, and that's really up to the event to decide. Yeah.
Is that true even if you have like a Japanese degree?
So I would say that the actual certificate is not that important, but the actual skill is definitely important. And there are people with JLPT's 1 level certification who are not fit to serve in certain capacities. There are people with lesser certification who actually possess the skills that are required. but it really depends on what the task is that that person is asked to perform. All right. So let's see, gentleman in beard.
Where each girl's translator came across the phrase, the older beats moved when he was talking about how he was looking forward to the team putting to use. But the translator, being a native English speaker, not a native Japanese speaker, never heard anything about the older beats cooking, and it led to a really awkward moment there. How do you handle situations where you come across unfamiliar vocabulary, still trying to keep a smooth flow to the experience?
Okay. So the question was, what do I do if I come up with, well, if I need to translate or interpret something that I'm not familiar with? And this entirely depends on what it is. If it's a generic language situation, then 9 times out of 10 you can get it from the context. And if it's critical to interpreting or to conveying the idea, and I actually don't know, in a convention setting, at the very minimum, you usually have the option of asking for clarification to the speaker. And clarifications are almost always allowed in that sort of a scenario, because there are plenty of cases where somebody would say something where they would actually say it wrong. And it's like, do you actually want to say this, or did you actually mean to say this? So you can get clarifications before moving on. And unless you're doing that for every other word, they're not going to mind too much. One case where I truly don't mind asking for clarification is proper nouns. There are people who go on stage and speak about like 20 of their friends. I'm sorry, I don't know 20 of your friends. So the ones that are critical, I will get them get clarification and write down the names and then translate. And then sometimes I have to say, who is that person? Why is that person important? Is that an animator? Is that a director? And anyway, so as long as I can make it quick, I ask for clarification if need be. And hopefully, if you're at the level that you're on stage interpreting, everything is smooth enough that 1 or 2 of those questions aren't going to bother people. Right?
How often do you run into issues where an English speaker is asking a question about a particular anime or manga, but they're using the official localized terms as opposed to an actual translation of the original Japanese meaning? So how often do you run into confusion because of things being localized?
Right. Localized names, localized titles. Those are pretty awful. So as an interpreter, like I'm also in the capacity to schedule panel interpreting at Otakon, for example. I try to send that schedule out to the interpreters somewhat early. I try to aim for 2 weeks early, and I'm sure all the panel interpreters that work for me will laugh at me when I say 2 weeks, because I don't often get 2 weeks. But anyway, I send them out in advance, and part of their task is to make sure that they can perform. So let's say, for example, that the panel is about Gundam. Well, part of their task is to look up and see what Gundam is, look up all the titles, all the characters, and to be able to familiarize themselves about like what are the main characters, what are the main people who worked on it, and if it's gotten localized, to see what the localized terms are. Like if the panel interpreter goes on stage knowing that a panel is about a certain anime and they don't know the official title in both Japanese and English, that interpreter hasn't done their job. It's one thing if they've gotten 2 minutes notice, but if they've had like at least 3 days of notice, if they don't know at least some of the key things and they go on stage, then that's their issue at that point. That's my homework to get to before I go on stage. There are times that the people will say, well, your anime reminds me of this other thing. Then I'm mostly off the hook. Fortunately, in those kinds of scenarios, either somebody on stage or somebody in the audience will know what it is. If I truly don't know, I ask for help from the audience or the person on stage, especially if it's something that the person's worked on. If it's something that the person's worked on, I ask them, yeah, it's this title. And then I just move on at that point. Again, the chance of me having to do that is relatively little. The chance of a title coming up that is utterly unrelated to something that the person has worked on is relatively little. That if I have to do it twice, if I have to ask the audience twice in a panel, that's a lot. As long as I'm not doing that for everything, it's usually not a problem. Does that answer your question? Okay. I think I have like maybe time for one more question. All right. Is that a hand up or is that a 5-minute hand? 5 minutes. Okay. Any other questions? Did I answer every question? Okay, I see a hand up in the back. Okay, so how did I decide to become an interpreter? It was forced on me. My path is unusual enough that this is not going to be of help to any of you all. So as you recall, I'm a travel agent in my real life. So my first involvement was I arranged flights for conventions, and this was for my local convention. And the person who runs that convention said, "Oh, wait a minute, you're bilingual. You can come and help us." And then I did some non-panel duties at first. And she's like, "Oh, but your language is good enough. Maybe you can go on stage." And then they were like, then some other staff members are like, "Oh, you helped this other convention with travels. Maybe you can help this, my convention with travels." And then, "Oh, maybe you can staff our convention too." So in all cases where I was an interpreter on stage, I was their travel agent first. And then I got dragged into it. So no, this is not a path that I recommend any of you to follow. But generally speaking, interpreters are in short supply between Japanese and English. So if you're at the level where you can perform fully as a bilingual staff, then chances are pretty good that there will be an event that will take you on. All right, I think that's going to be your last question, so go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so here's a question. So how important is understanding like the colloquial aspect of the language, like, how they speak, in their, when they're not being formed with each other, like how important is understanding like the culture in terms of how you decide you're going to, in your own words, convey a particular translation to a group?
Sure. Understanding culture in colloquial terms, it's pretty important. You absolutely have to understand the culture. Otherwise, what you think is what the other person said may not be what the other person said. And the colloquial terms, it's important to be able to understand them, because otherwise you have no chance of interpreting correctly. But whether you also use the colloquial terms, you get a little bit of pass on that. If you can, that's great, especially in like a convention panel setting. If you can speak at the right tone at the colloquial level, then that conveys the atmosphere and the ideas better. So that's great. Well, you can't always do that. So I would say that's great when you can, and and the people who can do it are probably the best interpreters that everybody look for. That's very few. I'm not even sure that I know a handful at that level. But you, as long as you try your best to convey the right ideas about the right level, even if you don't get the exact colloquial terms in the other language, you do get a pass. Now, but you do have to understand what it is that the other that they are trying to say. So does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's all the time I have, and I'm encouraged because I think I have more people in the room now than I did at the beginning. So thank you very much for staying. And I do have a travel panel at 6 p.m. So if anybody wants to ask more questions about travel, please come. And otherwise, thank you very much for your attention.